Hello! For this design dive, I'm going to be taking a look into an app-driven tabletop RPG that I released about a year ago called Critical Success. It's free on the Google Play Store, there's a web-hosted version and a PC build on itch.io that are linked below. This project started from me reflecting on all my years of running D&D with my friends and the dozens of people that I introduced the game to. It became clear to me that D&D wasn't for everyone for a lot of good reasons, because D&D presents a very particular and very narrow fantasy. But the parts of D&D that are unique to dice-based role-playing games don't need to be so exclusionary. So I started working on this RPG. Originally it was all paper-based, and then when I got that down I decided to make a companion app to alleviate the time of character creation and tracking progress, since an app could automate all of those things. To start off, I completely removed all ancestries and classes from the system. If you want to be an elf, that's fine, you can just assign your starting stats to enforce your fantasy of being an elf. To me, the system is meant to be about the choices of the player when they're playing, not the choices they make before they start playing. So things like ancestries and classes seem like a natural thing to try to remove, because it sort of is you being beholden to the decision you made when starting out, and it sort of limits a lot of your options up to that point. The way an RPG resolves conflict is the core of every other system of the game, and I wanted to keep that mitigation of randomness that most tabletop RPGs have, but I didn't want to have the slow pace of each action having a random chance at failure. So in Critical Success, each action you choose to take succeeds by default. The only exception to this is when someone else is committing an action specifically to stop your action. For instance, if you're attacking someone, they can dedicate a block action to stop the damage from your attack, and then you can compare your attack roll plus your stat modifications to their block roll plus their stat modifications to see who actually wins that conflict. This actually works great since it scales to all actions that you can think of as long as there is a counter action in the game as well. So lying to someone that trusts you will work, but if someone has a reason to be skeptical, then they will roll to resist your attempt at tricking them. That's actually a really good example of how binary outcomes are resolved. They either believe you or they don't. But with something like combat, there was an issue that came up with playtesting where most of the game the players were getting to make decisions and see how well they succeeded, which gives the game a good pace that keeps the players having agency and keeps the story moving. But combat seemed to immediately stop this, since each action either being blocked or dealing damage felt a lot like a miss or a hit from other systems. And this works great for those systems, but feels really out of place for a system that keeps the pace of progress so much higher than the norm for games like this. So I added some determinism to the combat to solve that problem of combat ruining the pace of the game, and gave each weapon a base damage that always gets dealt, and also has a range of damage that can be blocked, which is based on your skills. This made combat much more deadly, and suddenly tactics became important because any edge that you got over an opponent could mean an easy victory, since you're guaranteed to do some damage with each attack. And it also made the development of things like weapons a lot more interesting, because suddenly there are more consistent weapons than other weapons, to where one might be more risk-reward inherently, or at least more stat dependent, and other ones might be really consistent regardless of your stats. That all sort of led me to the core of the system, and I built everything else out from that included the app. So the app tracks everything for you. It tracks the actions you do, which is your experience. It levels up your skills and stats for you, and once you select your starting stats and your starting equipment, you're immediately ready to start playing. There are 3 core stats your player has, Vitality, Agility, and Acuity, that each govern 3 skills. Vitality governs the skills Athletics, Medicine, and Melee, and for each Vitality level you get 10 extra health. Agility governs Reflex, Speed, and Aim, and for each Agility level you get an extra free action each turn. And Acuity governs Learning, Convincing, and Willpower, and for each Acuity level you get 5 health and 1 free spellcast per combat. Each action gives you an experience point towards the skill that governs it, and for each 3 skill levels governed by a specific stat, that stat level goes up as well. Each time you roll, you add both your skill level for that action's required skill, but also the stat level for whatever stat governs that particular skill. The system ended up being a bit complex for a pen and paper session, so I really am leaning on the app to make this data management possible for players. But from my experience running with the system, it really lets players only worry about their going to do moment to moment, which is completely worth the reliance on the app. And I also think that it's worth this sort of dependent hierarchy of actions to skills to stats that makes everything sort of based around what the player does. So from this core system, I think it's pretty clear that actions are really the core of the game, which is true of most RPGs, but this game really puts it front and center with each action being directly used as experience points. Besides each action being governed by bonuses from a skill, equipment is the thing that gives you access to different actions. There's a clear funnel of how the actions in the game lead to progress, which I've kind of gone over. How each time I choose a new action, then it's actually going to just give me a new experience point for that, and that just gets tracked. So each time I want to try to make progress, it really just depends on what actions I do over time, and that's going to just passively build up my skills, and that's going to passively build up my levels, which gives me these very tangible resources like health, bonus actions, free spells, that I can then use in comparison with whatever equipment I use, and that's going to kind of give me the progress throughout the game, and that's going to give me the utility that I need in order to make the same kind of dynamic decisions that you can make when you have a specialized class, or if you have some kind of racial bonus or racial ability that is pretty common in most RPGs. And in practice, this design of it being action-based did a great job of making players choose actions based on the skills they wanted to focus on. They were clearly building a playstyle that they enjoyed, but this also added some conflict whenever they wanted to do an action that wasn't something they had any levels in. But this also kind of added back in that sort of funny emergent moment that gave game masters easy fodder to move the story along in interesting ways, which is really, I think, a benefit to the system, because when you have something that's more deterministic, to where the majority of the player's actions are actually guaranteed to work as intended, this sort of adds back in some of that randomness in a way that isn't pass-fail, but more based on the circumstances and the decisions that the player made. Having this list of explicitly chosen actions to choose from also meant that players always know their options and have a reference to it in the app. So when playing with new players, it's very common to have them ask what exactly they can do in a particular situation, and this even comes up with experienced players once they're in difficult or new situations. Just giving the actions possible and having them be robust enough seemed like it solved a lot of the problems with game flow and specific turns taking too long, which is a constant struggle in all other tabletop games that I've played. In structured conflict like combat or an argument, action usage is limited by the category that they fall under. So there's the free action, which lets you choose any action you want to use, including an attack. The attack action, which lets you use any weapon you have equipped. Block actions let you try and negate the variable damage of an attack. Dodge actions that do the same thing, but also let you move, meaning you can reposition or potentially dodge a spell. Cast actions are what lets you use a spell, and the reflex action lets you use any action you want on someone else's turn. Which of these actions are best to have access to completely depends on your stats and your enemy, because your success with them depends on your stats and also what kind of actions or what kind of attacks your opponent is using. Once I had this core system here where it's sort of actions and stats kind of all building together, and then there was sort of a constraint placed on specific situations like combat or arguments, to where the actions that you had and the actions your opponent had became really important, I decided to add a robust mechanic that lets players subvert these systems, the magic system. Magic in this game is cast by spending your health, but each level and acuity that you gain, you get a free spell cast per combat. To balance out that cost of spending your health in order to cast spells, magic is incredibly powerful, and there's even a spellcrafting system that can easily be used in each moment that you're casting a spell just by doing simple modifications. If you want your spell's effect to not be dodgeable, then spend a little bit extra health and you can make it instant. If you want to hit multiple close-range enemies, then make the spell a cone effect. You can also use spells to heal and do things like charm an enemy in combat or make somebody your friend in the middle of a heated argument. And this sort of high-risk and high-reward playstyle allows for flexible builds for characters that aren't even specialized in magic, and a go-to focus for more experienced players that are maybe a little bit more familiar with the way that the core combat system and action economy actually works. And in practice, this magic system definitely seemed to draw in power gamers and have them focus on min-maxing their stats so that they could have enough health and free spells to dominate a combat by doing massive damage on each turn while being hard to threaten. So to mitigate this, I made each spell type be limited to a spell book that needed to be equipped. So this made it so those same kind of players always had to sacrifice some other mechanic, some other kind of armor for more versatile clothing, or always had to choose if they wanted 2 categories of spells at their disposal, or a weapon and a spell, and any kind of combination of those things. Whereas before it was a little bit too freeform, where magic was sort of something that you could keep these other actions in your pool and then still cast spells on top of that. And that was definitely a improvement to the system, and I think really aided the high risk, high reward, but also limiting at least some of the other mechanical capabilities of the system. The overall goal for the project was to make something that doesn't alienate potential players, has a lot more of a focus on the player's choices, and something that can be picked up and started without a ton of preparation, time, or commitment. But I feel like I achieved the design goals for the project and learned a lot about what goes into balancing an RPG system, as well as what goes into making these systems and content work together for both the game master and the players. I think the balance between these skills, stats, and actions was definitely the strongest part of the design, and I do feel like I made these categories a little bit too broad than the game actually really needed, since I wanted this system to be portable to other common settings like horror or modern day or sci-fi. And I think I would have made the fantasy theme more explicit in the systems and the terms that I used if I were to make a version 2 of this RPG. With that, I want to thank you for watching, and try out the game below if you have a gaming group that may be down for a quick one-shot of a new system. And subscribe for more game development related videos every week. And if you got this far into the video, consider supporting my development on projects like this on Patreon, which is going to be linked on the screen. Thank you.